Wildflowers in the Desert by Simon Cross. The scorching New Mexico sun beat down on Margaret Thorne as she guided her horse along the dusty trail towards Silver Creek. Her father's words echoed in her mind. "The West ain't kind to dreamers, Maggie." But here she was, 22 years old, following her dreams straight into the untamed territory. The year was 1875, and like the wildflowers that somehow thrived in this harsh landscape, Margaret was determined to bloom where she'd been planted. After inheriting her uncle's general store in Silver Creek, she'd left behind the comforts of her family's ranch in Texas, much to her father's dismay. The distant sound of hoofbeats drew her attention. Through the shimmer of heat waves, she spotted a rider approaching. Her hand instinctively moved to the small pistol hidden in her skirt pocket, another of her father's parting gifts. The rider materialized from the heat haze, tall, broad-shouldered, with dark hair and a strong jaw shadowed by several days' worth of stubble. His clothes were trail-worn but well-maintained, and the badge on his vest caught the sunlight. "A U.S. Marshal?" "Miss," he said, touching the brim of his hat. "These parts ain't safe for solitary travelers. Been tracking a gang of outlaws headed this way." "I appreciate your concern, Marshal." "Reid. Daniel Reid." His eyes, the color of summer storms, met hers. "And you are?" "Margaret Thorne. Though most call me Maggie." She straightened in her saddle. "I'm headed to Silver Creek, my uncle's store." "James Thorne's place?" A shadow crossed his face. "Miss, I'm afraid there's something you should know." The news hit her like a physical blow. Her uncle's store had burned down 3 days ago, with him inside. The local sheriff suspected arson, but had no leads. Margaret's dreams of independence crumbled like ash in the wind. "I'm sorry, Miss Thorne," Marshal Reid said softly. "I knew your uncle. He was a good man." Tears threatened, but Margaret refused to let them fall. "Was it the outlaws you're tracking?" "The Carson gang. They've been forcing protection money from businesses along the territory. Those who refuse," he left the sentence unfinished. Margaret's grief crystallized into determination. "Then I'll rebuild. Better than before." Reid studied her for a long moment. "It's not that simple. The Carson gang doesn't take kindly to being defied. They'll be back. Then let them come." Her chin lifted. "I won't let them win." Over the next weeks, as Margaret worked to clear the charred remains of her uncle's store, Daniel Reid became a frequent visitor to Silver Creek. He claimed it was to protect her from the Carson gang, but his lingering glances and the way their hands would brush as they worked together spoke of different motivations. The townsfolk whispered, of course, about the proper young lady from Texas working alongside a marshal, about the way she'd transformed the burned-out shell of her uncle's store into something new. The mercantile rose from the ashes, its fresh painted walls and wide windows a testament to Margaret's determination. Daniel helped when he could, between pursuing leads on the Carson gang. He taught her to shoot properly, that Derringer's fine for close range, but you need something with more reach, and she taught him the finer points of bookkeeping. Their evenings often ended on the store's back porch, watching the sunset paint the desert in shades of gold and purple. "Why did you really come out here?" he asked one evening, as they sat side by side on the porch steps. Margaret considered the question. "To prove something, I suppose, to myself, to my father, that I could make my own way." "And have you? Proved it?" She smiled. "I'm beginning to think there are more important things than proving points." Their first kiss tasted of coffee and promise, sweet and bitter all at once. But their budding romance was interrupted by the return of the Carson gang. They came at night, 6 riders strong. Margaret woke to the sound of breaking glass. She grabbed the rifle Daniel had given her and made her way downstairs, careful to avoid the creaking third step. 2 men were ransacking her store, while others waited outside. Through the window she could see their horses stamping nervously in the moonlight. She took aim at the ceiling and fired a warning shot. "Get out of my store." The men whirled, guns drawn. "Well, look who's got some spirit," the taller one sneered. "Carson's gonna want to handle this one personal-like." "Carson's not handling anything." Daniel's voice rang out from the doorway. He had his revolver trained on the outlaws, and Margaret could see shadows moving outside, deputies positioning themselves around the building. What followed was chaos, gunshots, breaking glass, shouts, and the thunder of hooves. When it was over, 3 of Carson's men were dead, 2 were in custody, and Carson himself had fled into the night with a bullet in his shoulder. Dawn found Margaret and Daniel sitting once again on her back porch, watching the sun rise over the desert. His arm was bandaged where a bullet had grazed him, and her hands still trembled slightly, but they were alive. "I should go after Carson," Daniel said, but made no move to rise. Margaret leaned against him. He'll keep for another day. You know, when I first saw you on that trail, I thought you were just another eastern rose who'd wilt in the desert sun. He smiled down at her. I've never been happier to be wrong. And I thought you were just another lawman more married to his badge than to living. She touched his cheek gently. I suppose we both had some learning to do. The desert stretched out before them, painted in the soft colors of morning. Somewhere out there, Carson was nursing his wounds and plotting revenge. There would be more battles to fight, more challenges to face. But they would face them together, like the partnership they'd forged in the heat and dust of Silver Creek. Margaret thought of her father's warnings about dreamers in the West. He'd been wrong about that, just as he'd been wrong about her ability to make it on her own. Sometimes dreams did take root in the harsh soil of the frontier. Sometimes they bloomed like wildflowers after the rain, all the more beautiful for their unlikely existence. Daniel's hand found hers, warm and calloused. What are you thinking about? The future, she said, and how it's never quite what we expect. He laughed softly. No, it surely isn't. He turned to face her, his expression serious. Speaking of the future, I've been thinking. Silver Creek could use a permanent marshal's office. The town's growing, and with the railroad coming through next year. Are you asking me something, Marshal Reid? I'm asking if you might consider a permanent partnership. Both professional and, he cleared his throat, personal. And Margaret smiled. I thought you'd never ask. The sun climbed higher in the sky, promising another scorching day. But Margaret didn't mind the heat anymore. Like the wildflowers that bloomed in the desert, she had found her place to flourish. And like the steady man beside her, she had found something worth more than all the dreams that had brought her west. She had found home.